Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today I'm going to start maybe a series, maybe not, but at least a first show, which is kind of in keeping with the Berlin shows that I've done so far. So I've gotten quite a bit of positive feedback on those shows, and some people who probably were previously indisposed to even considering including such an opening in the repertoire have now expressed an interest in actually playing it and have been playing it. And I'd like to do the same thing perhaps with a different opening, and this is with the Catalan with white. So the Catalan arises after the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, and then g3. Alternatively, it can arise via the move order d4, knight f6, c4, e6. Say white plays knight f3 to avoid the Nimzo-Indian, d5, and now g3. So it comes to the same thing. Now, this opening, I believe it's the brainchild of the famous French and I think also Polish, and lived in a number of countries, Grandmaster Saviele Tartakover. And I think it's called the Catalan just because it was in a tournament in Spain when he played it, not because of any better reason. So, at any rate, the Catalan is kind of an interesting blend of classic ideas about the center with hypermodernism. So the classical approach towards controlling the center was that you control it by occupying it. So you put the pawns in the center, develop your knights on c3 and f3 with white, put your bishops on central squares, and so on. Whereas the hypermoderns took a different approach, and rather than occupying the center, or at least occupying it with very many pieces and pawns, preferred fianchettos in particular, so Indian defenses, especially with black, and had the idea that what you can do is let the opponent occupy the center, kind of subversively attack it and undermine it, and then having done so, then in the long run you'll get to have complete control by occupation as well as long distance control. So with the Catalan you get a bit of both. So you've got these central and near central pawns here, but you've also got this fianchetto coming up, which gives white a bit of both. Now in the Catalan, this bishop, when it gets to g2, is kind of the pride of white's position, and it exerts a great deal of influence on this diagonal. And black basically tries to do a couple of things with this, against this. One approach is to play c6, and strong point on d5. So d5 is, the pawn on d5, black is going to try to protect it with everything he's got and essentially make white's bishop on g2 bite on granite. Now that's a perfectly reasonable approach. The slight drawback to it is that it's rather passive. Black is really going to have only control over d5, but no control over really many squares on white's side of the board. And what white will often do in such circumstances is to finish the development and then go for the e4 advance. So white will generally have a pretty solid slight advantage in those positions, and black is really just trying to be solid and not let white get very much. So it's kind of like a Slav or Caro-Kann style approach where you're taking control over some light squares and making it very hard for white to get at you, but also it's not so easy for you to really get at white, on the other hand. Okay, so that's one approach. Second approach is to try to combat the bishop on the long diagonal. So a system where black ends up playing his bishop on this same diagonal by fianchettoing. And then the third setup, or the third approach, broadly speaking, is to just clear the diagonal altogether. So the pawn, black will probably take on c4, move his b pawn, move his c pawn, get the rook away from the diagonal, and in so doing try to neutralize this diagonal. Okay, white has this beautiful wide open diagonal, but if there's no targets on it, then who cares? So these are all different ways to play. All right. Now, the main line in the Catalan is the so-called open Catalan that continues with bishop to e7, bishop g2, castles, castles, d takes c4, and then white regains it with queen c2 and queen takes c4, but here we see black play b5 and bishop to b7. And this is as I said, exceedingly popular. In fact, it was played in one of the games in the first round of Linares, and it features heavily in. Well, Karpov used to play this with black all the time against it, and in fact, Karpov plays both sides of the Catalan, or did in his heyday. Kramnik plays this with white. Gelfand plays this with white. Aronian plays it with white. I mean, a lot of absolute top players try this opening from time to time with the white pieces. Ivanchuk has played this as well. So, at any rate, in this position, white's big idea, well, let me stop for a moment and say, put it the other way around. Black's big idea is to achieve the c5 break. And if he can do this without anything really bad happening to him, then he has very good chances for equality. Maybe not a guarantee, but he's certainly well on his way. So white will generally try to do things to make this break difficult. So one idea is to bring the bishop out somewhere, okay, sometimes to d2, with the idea of putting it on a5, trying to nail this pawn down in place, especially if black plays something like knight to d7, then bishop a5 is quite annoying. While if black plays knight to c6 to prevent that, well, the knight can get in the way of the pawn going to c5. Another approach is to just play bishop to e3, not only taking more control over that, but also getting out of the way so white can play rook to c1, knight to d2, knight to b3, and so on. All right, bishop to f4 is likewise again another approach, so immediately attacking the c7 pawn, and again doing so with tempo so the rook can go to c1 and again exert pressure and try to prevent this advance. Also bishop to g5, still one more idea. Get rid of that arrow. And with bishop to g5, sometimes white will take on f6 and force black to capture with the bishop when the bishop's no longer helping in the fight for the c5 advance. So these bishop moves are one part of the plan. a3 and b4 was played by Aronian in the round 1 game. So just actually it was after bishop to d2, bishop b4, queen c1, bishop b7. But all of these are again just different plans focused around preventing the c5 advance. Okay. Now, before getting to one particular line that I really wanted to focus on in our program today, I also wanted to mention, in a kind of a general way, that the Catalan, while it's, of course, a very positionally motivated opening, it can lead to incredibly sharp openings and some neat tactical ideas as well. We'll see a number of these in our discussion of the line that we're going to look at today, but I thought I'd also note a clever idea that Ivanchuk came up with 20 years ago. And in fact, what's interesting is it's never been played, but Anand writes about it in his Best Games book, in his discussion of his game against Joel Benjamin, the game where he has white. So this line starts like this. So bishop to e7 once again, bishop g2, castles, and now instead of white castling, it's a line with knight to c3, which is a little bit unusual. Okay, black takes, white plays knight e5, c5, dc, queen c7, knight c4, queen c5. And now there are something like 15 games in the database, and in every one of them, white plays queen to b3. Now, I think queen to b3 is a perfectly good move, actually, so there's not really anything wrong with this. But Ivanchuk's idea was quite interesting with b3. Now, black's best is probably knight to c6. And, okay, actually, I'll come back to that in a moment. But rook to d8 looks like a pretty natural move here. And, okay, so figure out what white's best is. So this is, let's say, our first little tactical puzzle of the night. So stop the recording if you want and try to figure out what white's move ought to do in this position. Well, the answer is this. White should play bishop to a3 here. Now, if black retreats the queen to c7, this will end up just transposing. So let's make the obvious move. Rook takes d1. Rook takes d1. And here, okay, black should probably play queen to h5, or moving the queen to some square on the king side. And white will take on e7. Now, materially, black is to be preferred. He's got a queen for a rook and a bishop. However, white has a large number of threats here. So there's rook to d8. There's the possibility of knight to b5 and knight c7. Knight to d6 is kind of annoying, hitting the bishop and increasing the threats against the b7 square. So this is really a pretty unpleasant position for black to deal with, and white's got a significant advantage. However, that is better than what will happen to black if he goes with his queen to c7, because now, kind of remarkably, white plays knight to b5, and the queen is simply trapped. So it's really remarkable. I mean, it's an open board, it's an opening, and nevertheless, black's queen is stuck. So it can't go to the d file because of the rook. It can't go to c6 because of the bishop on g2. It can't go to b6 or a5 because of the knight on c4. Also, e5 is covered by the knight on c4. The pawn on g3 covers the f4 square. The h and f pawns cover queen takes g3, and so on. So I mean, there's just it's remarkable how many pieces white needs to execute this trap, but somehow 7 or 8 units are all working together to make this happen. So that's his clever idea. And so, okay, after b3, the best move is knight to c6, and on bishop to a3 to play knight to b4. Now, white's a little bit better here after castling. His development is much more harmonious. Black, of course, has this annoying pin knight on b4. But it's not really clear that this is better for white than what he gets with just queen to b3. But you see that, I mean, even in the most apparently sedative openings, there can be these nifty little traps. But as we'll see, the Catalan, while it can be very much a positional opening with these little fine finesses making the difference, it can also explode into a realm of tactics, as we'll see. So instead of bishop to e7, black can play the immediate d takes c4. And, okay, well, what now? If white tries to regain the pawn straight away with queen a4 check, kind of like the open Catalan variation that we saw earlier, so just to refresh your memory, bishop e7, bishop g2, castles, castles, dc, queen c2, a6, queen c4, b5, queen c2, bishop to b7. Okay, so we saw this, material's even, and white is going to really try hard to prevent c5 most of the time. Okay, so dc4. If white tries to play the same kind of system here, so queen a4 check, knight b to d7, queen c4, a6, bishop g2, b5, queen c2, bishop to b7, we see here that this just isn't the same thing. So black is in much better shape in this variation than in the other one. He's simply going to be able to play c5 without any real difficulty. So castles, and now c5. So in the other line, black had played bishop to e7 and castles here. The difference now, of course, is that black's king, well, it's safe where it is for the moment. So there's not really any rush for it to castle, and so the tempi have been much more usefully spent on these queenside developing moves. So knight b to d7 and c5 instead of bishop to e7 and castles. And black is just at least equal. In fact, black has a pretty significant plus score in the databases here. So that means that after black plays d takes c4, white has to kind of change gears here. So bishop to g2 is standard, and now black can play very dynamically with knight to c6. Now, it's a little bit unusual for black in a d-pawn opening to bring his knight out in front of the c-pawn. But here, because of various tactical factors, it's quite doable. So black is attacking white's d-pawn a couple of times, which gives the white queen a little bit less freedom of movement. Now, you could play something like e3, but that's kind of an ugly move. I mean, it blocks in the bishop from c1 and weakens the f3 square a little bit, and it's just not very appealing. So white should continue to play actively now with queen to a4. And here the hope is not only to recapture the pawn. See, now that black's knight is on c6, as I mentioned, it's going to be tougher for him to achieve c5. So black, by playing knight to c6, is really taken on some commitments here. And it's essentially kind of a fundamentally greedy approach, or certainly a very tactical approach. Okay, so white's threatening to take on c4, and is also threatening knight to e5, piling up on this pin knight on c6. Okay, so here black plays bishop to b4 check. White's best is bishop to d2. And now knight to d5. So again, grimly hanging on to that c4 pawn, at least in an attempt to cause white some real discomfort before he can recoup the material. Okay, well, one thing white might try here is queen to b5. So kind of swinging around this bishop on b4, and again hoping to recapture the pawn. And even though it's taking some extra time, The thought is that the knight on c6 is maybe slightly misplaced, and also the knight on d5 is liable to get kicked by e4 at some moment. Okay, well, the main move here, I think, let me check the frequencies here. Yeah, bishop takes d2 is indeed the most common move here. And after knight b takes d2, okay, if he castles, then queen c4, knight b6, queen c3, knight d5, and so on. White has done quite well in this position. So this hasn't really achieved anything especially good for black. Okay, so the most common move here, and probably the most principled approach, is c3, keeping the extra pawn. All right, so we have this exchange. White brings the queen back. Say both sides castle. And now I think white gets very, very good compensation for the pawn by bringing his rooks to the c and b files. So one rook goes here, one rook goes there, plays e4, and, well, I think it gives him a good game. So rook f to c1, say h6, rook a to b1, knight to b6, e4, queen e7, knight b3. So this knight is also going to find an excellent square on c5. Rook to d8, and white sidesteps the pin here, potential pin with queen e3. And I think white went on to win this game. So this is from a game, Kachav against Inkiov from a French tournament in 2003, and I believe white won. So white's the well-known grandmaster. I'll just spell his last name, Tkachiev. So I've heard Kachav and all kinds of other pronunciations. So I'll just, I'll move on to a different topic where I don't have to worry about pronouncing his name. But in any case, in this position, I think white has more than adequate compensation for the pawn. However, here, after queen to b5, instead of bishop takes d2, I think with just castling, black ends up with a reasonable position. So queen c4, knight b6, queen d3, e5, and this is often the case. So in d-pawn openings where black plays knight to c6 and blocks the c-pawn, very often what will justify it for him is if he can play e5. Okay, so takes, queen drops back. a5 is a good move because interpolating a5 and a3 leaves white with some weakened light squares over on the queen side. So knight c6, de, queen e7, and this occurred in a game between Chabanon and Hausrat from Belgium in 2007. This position is equal. So black is going to regain the pawn, no problem. I mean, if white plays queen c3 or queen f4, black can just play rook to e8, and the e5 pawn is a goner. So it looks like this approach with queen to b5, trying to just regain the pawn and keep everything nice and calm, probably isn't the best approach. So bishop takes b4, knight d takes b4, and here we have really a key position, and there are a lot of different moves that white has tried here. So let's start with a very sharp approach with a3. And here I would suggest taking a little time and trying to figure out what black's move should do, and to try to figure out as best as you can how to assess the complications. So really this is a position not just to stop for a few minutes, though you can try, but I mean you can even stop it for a few hours, a few days, and try to figure out what ought to happen. I mean this leads to incredible complications. Okay, well let's dig into the jungle here. Black's only good move here is b5. Now if white retreats the queen to d1, his strategy is just an abject failure. Black retreats the knight to d5, and he's simply up a pawn for inadequate compensation. So queen takes b5, knight c2 check, and now white's best move is king to d2. And here black has two very interesting approaches. Okay, approach number one is knight takes a1, most obvious move. Let's work through this first. Queen c6 check, bishop to d7, queen takes c4. And here, white is doing quite well as far as material goes. I mean, he's down the exchange, but he's got a pawn for it. And the knight on a1 is, of course, in grave danger. So white is, from a purely material standpoint, in fantastic shape. But, of course, with the king on d2, there's always the potential for some problems. Now, in some old games, black used to play rook to b8, but this seems not so good. So b4, c5, and all of a sudden things look kind of dangerous, because if b takes c5, then the knight can escape via b3. If d takes c5, well, that just loses. Or it's, well, maybe it doesn't lose, but it's incredibly risky. I mean, making all kinds of bishop discoveries possible. I mean, there's bishop to b5. Yeah, of course, it does win, right, of course, because if d takes c5, bishop b5, queen d4, knight to b3 check. So that's completely hopeless there. D takes c5 is a blunder. Okay. So, and queen takes c5 is, of course, catastrophically bad as well, because of the obvious knight to b3 check. So, white should just ignore the c-pawn, though, and play queen to c3. And after c takes b4, a takes b4, a5, still trying to rip open lines, queen takes a1. White is probably winning here, or at least very close to winning. He should be able to consolidate without too terribly much difficult a time of it. So he can bring the rook to d1, the king goes to e1, and basically once that happens, white's just fine and up material. All right, so it might seem at first glance like this position after queen takes c4 is very good for white. But Korchnoi, in a 1989 game against Ivanchuk, was able to demonstrate that white's task is not quite so simple with the move c5. And now, okay, it's a little bit less clear here. Okay, white can't take the pawn either way, so he should continue with this basic plan of queen to a2. All right, queen to a5 check. And now, in the stem game, Ivanchuk-Korchnoi from Tilburg, 1989, Ivanchuk played b4. But after c takes b4, queen a1, rook c8, knight e5, bishop to b5, Korchnoi had very serious attacking chances and, in fact, went on to win in just 9 more moves. And, if anything, he could have even won more easily in the game. So, white is still okay here, but it's a very, very precarious position, and white should, I think, avoid this if he can. And, indeed, he can. So, after queen to a5 check, the better move is knight to c3. All right, so this has been seen quite a few times, and even at the very highest levels. So c takes d4, knight takes d4, rook to d8, rook takes a1, e5. Now, materially, white is in terrific shape, and if his king was just on e1 already, the game would be basically over from a standpoint of professional players. But the king is still on d2. It's not quite so simple. Okay, b4, queen b6, knight c2. And now bishop to e6 check doesn't win the queen because white can play bishop to d5 and take care of everything. So queen takes f2. And here knight to e3 has been played, but the main move is considered to be bishop to d5. Okay, black castles. Queen to c4, bringing the queen back into play. Bishop e6, knight e3, queen takes h2. So now material is roughly equal, but white has really done a pretty good job of consolidating. And after queen to h4, takes and takes, white's position might be even a little bit better. So this has occurred in several games. I think they've all gone like this. Okay, and now here, in a game between Kasparov and Adams in Vaikonze in 2001, white played rook to d1, and after f4, knight c4, the players agreed to a draw. However, in a later game, so a game played in the same tournament the next year between Kazimzhanov and Von Wely, Kazimzhanov played rook to g1, which was a very good novelty and offered him an advantage. And in fact, he went on to win the game. So it's not a huge advantage, but it's a small advantage. So we have this very interesting material imbalance. White's got 2 knights for a rook and a pawn. Black has a nice massive kingside pawns, but no passers yet. And in fact, white has his own queenside majority that he can try to utilize as well. And I believe in that game he finally does use it. So this line seems to be okay for white, and maybe even has some chances for an edge still. Okay, so you recall we had this position as our starting spot, and we were just looking at knight takes a1. However, black has a better move, bishop to d7. And as far as I can tell, if anything, black is to be preferred here. Now, if white tries to play as he did in that other variation with king takes c2, with queen takes c4, the difference is that after knight takes a1, white doesn't have any pieces for the rook, so he just has one pawn for it. He hasn't managed to win the knight on c6 first. So here, attempts to round up this knight are going to be a failure. Well, I mean, he can win it, but now his king is just going to get hammered to bits. So if he tries to play queen to a2, I think this simply fails to knight a5, and thanks to the b3 square, black may not even lose that knight. Okay, so b4 is probably forced, but now after e5, the center is going to open, and white won't be able to survive this. Black is winning. So after bishop to d7, white is actually forced to sacrifice his queen with king takes c2. Okay, the following moves are more or less forced. Okay, and now white should prevent black from castling. So we can either play bishop to c6 check first, or rook to d1 first. It doesn't matter, it'll come to the same thing. So rook to d1, queen g5, bishop checks, king f8, knight 1 to c3, and queen to c5. Okay, so black has a queen and a pawn for 3 minor pieces. The problem for white, I mean, white has good development and has the control of the d-file and quite a few things that are in his favor, but one problem is the b-file. And as we'll see, this maybe gives black some chances for an edge. Okay, so bishop to f3, and now not rook takes b5. Rook takes b5 is a mistake. After rook to d8 check, white has a serious advantage. So black should play g6, ready to meet rook to d8 with king to g7. So now white has to save his knights. So knight to d4, king g7, rook d2, rook h to d8, rook a to d1. Okay, now there was a game between, is it Lecco and Adams? Yeah, Lecco and Adams that concluded like this. Queen to b6, knight a4, queen a5, knight c3, queen b6, and so on. And they agreed to a draw. This is from Dortmund in 2006. But after rook to d6, which has the important point that the rook on the rook on the d-file is now safe from various tricks like knight takes e6. So there's nothing like this to be worried about anymore. All right, so rook to d6. Rook to d6 takes care of that. And it also has a little trap. So if knight to c6, white just loses. So why is that? This is maybe a 10-second problem. Well, the problem with knight c6 is that black gives up the exchange, plays queen to b6 with a double attack, threatening the bishop and mate on b2. White's only way of stopping both threats for the moment is with bishop to b5, but after a6, black is clearly better. But in fact, it's really hard to give white a good suggestion here. I mean, he could play e3, solidifying the knight. But after after queen to b6, knight a4, queen a6, let's say knight to c3 again, e5, it just the position really just doesn't work out very well for white any longer. I mean, he's becoming more passive. He's got these problems on the b file, and black has a very big advantage here. And I don't really see any way for white to improve. Maybe there's something. I mean, probably if I look deeply enough, I'll find some way for maybe white to equalize, but the burden is on him. So it seems ultimately that this line with a3 isn't the best way to go. Well, what else can he play? All right, well, a second approach is knight to e5, and this is a very logical move as well. I mean, we've got this pin here, and we might as well triple up on this knight on c6, so it's hit 3 times. And we're also hitting the pawn on c4 too, so there's that as a fringe benefit. But the main point really is the serious pressure against this knight on c6. All right, well, you might think that black should play bishop to d7 here. And this worked out well in a game between Osenid and Adams from Kilkenny in 1999. As you may have guessed by now, Adams is a real connoisseur of this variation. Okay, so that game went white castled, Okay, knight takes e5 isn't so good here because after queen takes b4, white regains the c4 pawn with a good position. So castles, castles, knight c6, queen c4, e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5. And then here, Osanade played queen f4, queen e7, knight c3, c6. And with this move, he takes the d5 square under control and also blocks the bishop's diagonal, and the b7 pawn is now safe too. So after rook f to d1, f6, Adams had achieved equality in the game. I don't know how it ended. I mean, Adams, I'm sure, went on to win. Yeah, he did, because he's 500 points stronger than his opponent. But as of this point, it was just equal. However, instead of queen to f4, Boris Averuk gives a very good suggestion here to play instead the move queen to d5. And the whole point of this is just to prevent black from achieving c6, and to that end, it's a very strong move. So black has to play knight c6 to save the knight and protect the pawn on b7. But now, okay, knight c3, rook comes over, queen c4, threatening knight to d5, which will win material because if queen to e5, f4, queen d6, knight to b6, discovering an attack on the queen and also hitting the rook. So black should play rook a to c8, preemptively guarding the c7 pawn, knight to d5, queen e5, hitting the b2 pawn, rook to d2, bishop e6, and rook a to d1. And you can see that all of white's pieces are better than their black counterparts. Additionally, the black knight on c6 is kind of stuck, having to shield the c file and also in some lines shield the b7 pawn. So this is a clear advantage for white. Okay, so we might think that we've found the answer to all of our problems if we're at least playing the Catalan with white with knight to e5. However, black can improve by castling straight away here. Alright, and now, okay, knight takes c6, knight c6, bishop c6, b takes c6, queen c4, rook b8. And this is a very typical kind of Catalan position. Material's even. Black has these sick queenside pawns, so he's got doubled c pawns and an isolated a pawn. But the bishop versus knight factor shouldn't be underestimated, and that's definitely to black's advantage. So there are going to be lines where he plays something like rook to b6 and bishop a6, or maybe plays queen to d5, and if the queen retreats, plays bishop to b7 and c5. And so black has good counter chances here. So it's not quite so simple. I mean, if white had finished development and his pawns were safe, and he could put the knight on a square like a4 or e4, heading for c5 and so on, might have a real advantage. But the position still has its dynamic potential, and black is okay here. So it looks like knight to e5 really isn't the answer to all the world's problems either. Okay, well, a third try is knight to c3. And this may not be a bad move at all. This might be a reasonable try. Aronian used it a couple of weeks ago against Mickey Adams and managed to win that game. So give a little bit of analysis here. Okay, bishop to d7 is one possibility. White maybe gets an edge like this. So he castles, a6. So black wants to play b5, of course, and own the c pawn forever. So white has to act fast with knight to e5. Okay, so the point is that black can play b5, but after queen a3, his position is surprisingly a little bit loose here. White's going to take on c6, bring the queen to c5, and then play a4, and attempt to show that black's queenside structure is maybe a little bit overextended. So rook to b8, knight c6, queen c5, again attacking the knight on c6, knight e7, saves the knight and prepares to castle, and now a4. And this occurred in a game between Pavlovich and Van den Doel in Dieren in 2008, and according to Sherbakov's analysis, white is slightly better here, or I should say according to his evaluation. So no further analysis. So this is promising for white, and another possibility is to play a6 immediately, and this is what Adams did, not bothering with bishop to d7 first. Okay, well here Aronian made a novelty, though it's kind of surprising that it's a novelty. Really, it's only a novelty because this position is just rare in general. So knight to e5 is a pretty obvious move and a good one. Okay, well, Adams chose to castle, and again we got this kind of structure. And white probably has a very small advantage here. It looked like there was maybe a position in the game where Adams could have equalized. So I'm not sure that white has an edge, but black has to play quite accurately here to hold the balance. One difference between this and the position where I said that it was pretty equal, so this position, of course white has already saved the pawn. He's maybe a development tempo up. But the other key thing is that with black having played a6, it takes that square away from the bishops. There's no rook to b6, bishop a6 ideas available anymore, and the pawn's just loose there as well. So this probably gives white at least pretty reasonable chances for an edge. So let's go back. Maybe a better chance for black is with bishop to d7 straight away, white castles, and I would say this is somewhere on that cusp between an equal position and white maybe having a very small advantage. Okay, so knight to c3 on move 9 here is maybe a pretty good idea. But I'll offer one more continuation. So simply castling. Who'd have thought it? Who'd have thunk it, right? Well, looks like it's pretty good. Okay, and black has again a couple of choices. There's bishop to d7, and there's rook to b8. So rook to b8 just clears the diagonal, prepares b5, while bishop to d7 is, of course, breaking the pin and trying to shore up the c6 square before knight e5 happens. Okay, well, the funny thing is after bishop to d7, knight e5 happens anyway. And in fact, we already looked at this when we were looking at the knight to e5, bishop to d7 move order. So the cure for knight e5 was castling right away, but if bishop to d7, which transposes to what we looked at, so castles, castles, remember we had this, knight c6, queen c4, e5, takes, queen d5, and so on. So we've got the exact same thing here. So after castles and bishop to d7, knight e5, and we go down that same route. And white, we saw, gets a pretty nice advantage in that position. Okay, so let's try rook to b8 instead. Well, here it's not knight to e5, and it's not knight to c3. Knight c3 can be played. This is in fact a very well-known line, and it looks as if black is okay. So this is another one of these lines where white's going to take a bunch of times on c6, give black these sickly pawns, but black will get reasonable counter chances. So a6, preparing b5, knight e5, castles. So of course if b5, then white is just winning, I think, with knight takes c6, or at least much better. So castles, knight c6, bishop c6, b takes c6. And here, okay, black is up a pawn, and he's threatening the b2 pawn, and he's threatening the d4 pawn. So queen takes c4 is best, rook b2, rook a to b1, and now an accurate move by black. What do you think that is? What should black play here? Well, the answer is rook to b6. So that way if rook takes b6, c takes b6, and black's queenside structure is perfectly good. So queen is c5. And here, maybe a little surprisingly, the main move is h6. But it's fared pretty well. Okay, rook f to d1, rook b1, and now similar move to rook to b6 a few moves ago, queen to d6. Okay, white plays knight to e4, not accepting the bait. Black offers it again. And funny enough, this time white will take it. So queen d5, c d5, knight c5. And here white certainly has very good compensation for the pawn. Maybe even a tiny bit more than full compensation for the pawn. But black's position is really pretty solid. And in fact, in a game between Halifman and Sergei Ivanov, who's also a grandmaster, but certainly not a player of Halifman's caliber, Ivanov was able to hold the position and draw. So he had to do a little bit of suffering, but he was able to hold. So I would recommend looking at that game, especially if you play the system with black. It's worth knowing how to defend that ending. And again, because these tripled pawn endings are quite common as well, so you should know about those setups if you play this line with black. Okay, well, instead of knight to c3, white has another move which is pretty interesting, and it's knight to a3, aiming to take with the knight on c4, and in doing so, the knight will protect the pawn on b2. So if we reach some kind of similar line where we've got these multiple captures, we've at least taken care of one of the problems. Okay, black again has several moves to choose from here. There's a6, there's castling, and there's bishop to d7. So if bishop to d7, funny enough, we go back to an idea we discussed quite a while ago now with queen to b5. So again, this little ring around the rosy, and it works out. So castles, queen c4, queen e7, e4, and white has a nice advantage here. And again, it's Kachav who was in action, this time against Godina from Cannes in 1999. Okay. Second approach, castling immediately. Once again, the cure is queen to b5. b6 takes, bishop a6, knight to b5. White's perfectly happy to have black exchange off his light-squared bishop. So black avoids it with queen to d5. But after takes, and then a4, white's going to put a rook on the c file. And you can see, thanks to b6, and this knight that's kind of clumsy on c6, white's going to have very good pressure here. So white has an edge in this position. All right. So a6 is probably the best move, just to stop queen to b5. Also threatens b5, but the main point is to stop the queen b5 takes c4 maneuver. Okay, knight to e5 is the only move that makes any sense here for white. Black should get out of town, castling. Knight takes, knight takes. Okay, and now if white tries to play solidly here with queen takes c4, queen takes d4 looks good enough to hold. So there's a game between Delchev and Adalik from the Bled Olympiad in 2002 that went like this. So takes, queen takes. So once again, we've got that structure. And here black is in pretty good shape. So of course, white's not in any real danger. Let me see if I can see what happened in that game. Yeah, so it ended up as a draw. I mean, white's not really in any danger in this position, but black is surprisingly okay too. I mean, yes, he's got the weak c pawn, but it's an extra. White's going to have to exert some effort to regain it. And once he does, the position is going to tend to level out. So queen takes c4 here doesn't seem so promising. So bishop takes c6 looks best. bc, and now knight takes c4. So he gives up the d pawn, keeps his queen side intact though. And okay, all this has happened before. And the rook c1 is a suggestion of Boris Avruk's that seems to be a novelty. Now, this may look like just the same kinds of things we've already seen. I mean, what's the big difference? But it does turn out somehow that white seems to be able to consolidate, regain his pawn, and keep some advantage. So just to give Avruk's main line, you can see what it looks like, and maybe you can improve on it for black. So it goes like this: e5, b3, queen g4, queen a3, queen to e6, knight a5. Okay, so now we're hitting the pawn on c6, bishop d7, rook c to d1, hitting the bishop, which retreats again. Okay, now rook to d8, and thanks to the queen on a3, white's threatening mate. So c5 is basically forced, and now the rook retreats to d5. The c pawn is going to drop basically by force here. And I think with that happening, and with white having given up nothing in the process, he should indeed have a pleasant advantage in this position. Thanks to the knight on a5, black's bishop can't really do any damage, jumping on the long diagonal and hurting white's king. So white is better here. I think that's a reasonable surmise. Okay, well, with that, I think I'm going to stop this theoretical survey at this point. Whether you choose to take up the Catalan or not, okay, I have no idea if this is going to whet your appetite to go that far yet, and there's quite a bit more to learn. But I do hope that I've at least shared with you a line that's very interesting. We've seen quite a number of different structures. I mean, we've seen these triple pawn structures for black, where it's this kind of interesting battle between black's dynamic chances and white's static advantages. But we also saw some very, very sharp lines involving queen sacrifices, involving black sacrificing a couple of pieces for a rook, and just a tremendous number of dynamic options are available in the Catalan for both sides. So I hope I've at least given you a glimmer of the richness of this opening. And this is just one of the variations. I mean, there are a large number of really interesting lines, as well as more positional, more control-oriented ones as well. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I may, from time to time, add some more discussion of the Catalan as well. So thanks. Look forward to your feedback, and I'll see everyone next week. Goodbye.